You're listening to the Rethinking Hell podcast, where evangelical Christians discuss what the Bible says about hell and put conventional and controversial views to the test. To continue the discussion and find more resources on this topic, you can visit us online at www.rethinkinghell.com.
Hello and welcome back to the Rethinking Hell podcast. I'm Chris Date, your host for today, and once again we've got the pleasure of treating you to a guest interview. But unlike our past interviews, this one is with one of our very own, fellow RethinkingHell.com contributor, Dr. Glenn Peoples. If you follow the blog, you may recall that back in August, Glenn wrote an excellent article examining how Christ's contemporaries would have understood his reference to the worms consuming corpses in Isaiah 66:24. And if you've listened to our past episodes, you'll have heard Glenn present a powerful positive case for annihilationism back in episode 4. If you haven't read Glenn's article or listened to his presentation, I definitely encourage you to check them out and let us know what you think. Today, Glenn joins me to discuss a letter that he posted in his blog back in June of 2011 entitled An Open Letter to My Traditionalist Friends. Now, after I had become convinced of conditional immortality, in part because of Glenn's work, much of what Glenn writes in this letter really resonated with me, and now I find myself wishing that every traditionalist would read it and take its message to heart. Hopefully that sparks your interest a little bit, so without further ado, let's just jump right into the interview. I'm joined today by my friend and fellow RethinkingHell.com contributor, Dr. Glenn Peoples. Glenn's personal blog is Say Hello to My Little Friend, which, coming out of his native New Zealand, is also the most widely listened to podcast on philosophy and theology in the Southern Hemisphere. His podcast series, Defending Annihilationism or Conditional Immortality, was what first got me rethinking hell, and he joins me today to discuss an open letter that he wrote to traditionalists explaining why he thinks they are losing ground in the evangelical debate over hell. Thanks for joining me today, Glenn.
You're most welcome, Chris.
Now, tell us first about your blog and podcast with the somewhat provocative name, Say Hello to My Little Friend.
Sure, okay. I started the website what seems like a long time ago. It feels that way. It was either 2005 or 2006. I don't even remember. I was still a student at the time, finishing my doctorate in philosophy, having done my previous work in theology. And I wanted to put some of my articles online as well as my CV so that I could show it to prospective employers and blow them away. I was still that naive. I also thought it might be fun to have an outlet for some of my thoughts as I was still studying at the time. And so I put the blog up in March 2006. I remember that because it was right after Ron Nash had passed away. And it was like the day before he had died. And then I put my blog up. So I mentioned him in my first blog entry, but I was pretty new to blogging, and I screwed it up and lost it, so that's not there. Things grew from there, and I was encouraged to start the podcast, which I've really enjoyed and has maybe become better known than the blog. The name Say Hello to My Little Friend, as you probably know, is a line from the movie Scarface. It's got no important connection to the blog. It's a gangster movie starring Al Pacino as Tony Montana as he kind of rises to the top and then falls. For me, the title is really a humorous way of saying, have at thee, because that's basically what he's saying when he says that, although they didn't quite have the same ring to it. The idea is that I want to be pretty ruthless in my approach, hopefully not rude or offensive, but pretty direct. I try not to have too many sacred cows, and I'm happy to challenge things that my evangelical cohorts take seriously. I don't mind using a bit of humor along the way at times, and the bottom line is that I try not to be too straight-laced. So that's what that's all about.
I see. And something that just occurred to me, a question that just occurred to me is when you bill your podcast and blog as being, the most popular in philosophy and theology in the Southern Hemisphere, to what extent is that exaggerated? Are there plenty of philosophy and theology podcasts in that area, or are you one of few, and so it kind of happens that you're the top?
Well, it's not an exaggeration if it's true. I don't think there are that many, no.
Okay. Well, still, it's very good, and I think it deserves that position. But anyway, many of us who believe that the unsaved will finally be annihilated used to hold to the traditional view of hell. I did, and as we're going to be talking about during the course of this interview, what you describe in the open letter we're going to be talking about are the kinds of things that converted me, if you will. Back in episode 4 of this podcast, the Rethinking Hell podcast, you mentioned briefly that you also had once been convinced of the traditional view. So tell us how you came to hold the view that you and I now share.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was raised Catholic, and I say that neutrally, not to say whether I think it's a good thing or a bad thing. But it meant that by default, the view of Augustine Aquinas was the one that I inherited without even thinking about it. I never so much as thought that there could be a reason, not a biblical reason anyway, to challenge that view. I just figured if you didn't believe that view, well, it's probably because you just didn't believe stuff in general about God. That changed. I left the Catholic Church, and in my mid to late teens, I was in a Baptist youth group, which is also not necessarily where you would expect to become an annihilationist. But the youth group leader was a bit of a renegade. He was an annihilationist. And I was absolutely horrified when I found out what he believed. But I was also really frustrated because I went running to my Bible to find all those passages that I thought would be there that I could throw back at him, and they just weren't there. And to be honest, I didn't think too much about it immediately afterwards. It kind of created the sort of cognitive dissonance in my soul. I didn't know what to make of the situation that I found myself in, and I just kind of left it alone. But a few years later, when I decided to take a proper look at the subject, well, the biblical evidence was still there. It was still the same. It just didn't support the traditional view, so I had to leave it behind. So, long, short answer, no. I used to be one, and not now, and that's, in a nutshell, how I got out of it.
Yeah. Well, so if you don't mind me asking, you've got a academic background and an academic career, even I think that you hope to have one day. How has your acceptance of annihilationism or conditional immortality, how has it impacted you professionally, academically, maybe even personally? Have you experienced any sort of negative consequences as a result of embracing this view?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to professionally and academically, sometimes it's not easy to know because it could be a bit like being asked what people are saying about me behind my back. But I mean, just look at the number of evangelical colleges that are out there, in the States at least, not so much in my part of the world. And although evangelicals are happy to describe themselves as people who are willing to challenge cherished traditions in light of Scripture, that's the line they like to take. I mean, that's why a lot of us think the Reformation took place at all. There's also a very strong, what I like to think of as a border control policy in places like that. Evangelicals see liberalism, they see skepticism, and yeah, these things are problems and they have to be addressed, but they have a really strong response mechanism. And so they respond with detailed statements of faith, they nail them to the college door, and if you don't measure up to what they think an evangelical is, then you're one of the liberals or skeptics and you don't get in. So yeah, professionally it puts up barriers, and that places constraints on the areas where someone who holds our view can work. There is that kind of mentality in spades out there in the blogosphere. If you think that, then you're a heretic. But who cares? I mean, that's the blogosphere. It's crazy. That comes with the territory, and it's not really consequential. But if there have been any changes in recent times, then I think there've been changes for the better. I mean, there are some places that I can't see changing anytime soon, but barriers, if they're moving at all, are coming down, which I think is good, probably as a result of so many very fine Christian scholars who are already in establishments who are, I guess, coming out.
Kind of like John Stackhouse, who we interviewed last episode.
Yeah, he'd be a good example. Yeah, exactly.
I agree with you. It seems like the climate is beginning to change, although it does still concern me that, there's a friend of yours who I'm not going to name, who I had tried to invite to talk about this topic on my podcast, and he had to decline because he is in the establishment, so to speak, in a certain respect. He's written a book that people talk about, but he can't come out really openly with this view because for fear of the negative consequences it might have on his career, So I guess I hope that things progress and change more quickly than they might seem to be. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm with you there.
Yeah. Well, okay, so we're recording this interview the same day that you recorded what will now be, when people are listening to this now, episode 4 of the Rethinking Hell podcast, which hopefully our listeners have listened to already. And in that episode, you present a positive case for the view. But this isn't the first time you've presented conditional immortality in podcast form. In fact, it was your series of episodes of Say Hello to My Little Friend which first got me wondering if I might have been wrong when I was still a traditionalist. Now, you recorded that series about 4 years ago, a little more than that, in fact. And as you explained in episode 4, Your cases remain basically the same because the Bible doesn't change, but has your positive presentation for our view changed at all since then? Have you discovered anything, any additional evidence which you weren't aware of way back then and which listeners might not have heard you present back in episode 4 of Rethinking Hell?
The short answer is no, even though that's not the most interesting answer I could give. The longer answer is the biblical evidence hasn't changed, of course. And the case that I make today is the same one that I've been making for a few years now. But there's a virtually unlimited number of ways to screw things up, to misuse the evidence and come up with bad arguments. So thanks to the material that traditionalists keep putting out there, where they keep doing just that, there are always new things to say about the issue.
Yeah. Well, besides the obvious impact that you've had on me, has your treatment of the topic impacted, other former traditionalists as well? Do you hear from others who first began rethinking hell as a result of your podcast?
Yeah, most definitely. At my own blog, through the podcast and in my own speaking and publishing, talking about hell takes up very little space, comparatively speaking, and yet that is the one issue that I get more contact about from people who have changed their view because of something I've said or written than anything else. And I don't really think I can take too much of the credit for that. I think it's a matter of circumstance and fact. The fact is, the case for the traditional view is awful. The biblical evidence for annihilationism is really strong. I didn't make that so. It just happens to be so. And a lot of Christians have just never seen the case made before. And in the circumstances where I'm the first exposure to the idea that someone gets, you can understand how things are likely to unfold. So yeah, it makes sense that they would reconsider their view when they see what I have to say, because I'm kind of lucky. I'm like the prosecution in a case where the defendant is obviously guilty, and was caught red-handed. You shouldn't get your photo in the paper for something like that, because it's always going to work out that way. So yeah, dozens upon dozens of people, more than, I don't know, I want to say hundreds, but I haven't been counting, but lots of people have contacted me to say that they've changed their mind on that issue after listening, which I guess means that plenty more changed their minds and didn't contact me. So I feel pretty blessed to have been in those circumstances.
Oh yeah, I got to imagine that to be in the position of being the kind of seed planter that I think that you've been, because I'm sure that many people had a similar experience to me, which is you were the first one to make me think, wow, I hadn't thought of this before. But it wasn't that convinced me. It was then the books, from Edward Fudge, and the various other treatments of the topic that I went and researched further that sort of took the seed that you had planted and, really brought it to fruition. So that's got to be a real blessing to be a part of that. Now, I want to start talking about this open letter that I mentioned when I introduced you. A little bit over a year ago, you published an article at your blog entitled An Open Letter to My Traditionalist Friends. Summarize for us what it is that motivated you to write it.
Frustration. Pure and simple. I mean, I remember quite clearly the circumstances that led me to write that. Frustration at two things, actually. First, frustration at just having finished reading yet another defense of the traditional view that was just terrible. It dawned on me yet again that evangelical standards on this issue are just way, way, way too low. And I thought, it's one of those moments, and you have these moments on various issues at various times when you think, someone has to do something about this. I thought, well, let's go and do something. Second, frustration at the outrage that had recently been expressed to me by another believer, one of the authors that I criticized, actually, for having the gall to say so. He was the author of the book that I had just read. And I was trying really nicely, I know I was, to explain where I think his exegesis was going really badly wrong. And he replied by saying that I take exception to being lectured about this. And he's a lecturer. I couldn't figure out why. He's always lecturing people about this. The idea was that I was offending him by saying that he was saying something unscholarly. And I just shouldn't be saying that. Look, we have to be able to do that. That's not an attack. That's like Simon Cowell on American Idol saying, look, for your own good, you can't sing. And I watch that sometimes, and I'm like, yeah, I understand why that's not going to be received well, but it's the truth, and you're actually better off being told. This is for your own good. So I'm all in favor of being loving, but if we set up rules about communication so that we can never say, no, you have really messed this up, then we've sacrificed truth in the name of being nice, which is not good. So a lot of that bubbled over in the letter that you're talking about.
Sure. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Simon Cowell. I would throw in there also Howard Stern, who's now hosting America's Got Talent right now. And, to be a little crass to use them as examples, what always struck me was that they're the ones who were the most brutally honest, but not not always rudely so, but we as the audience typically respect them far more than we do the people who blow smoke up the rear ends of the people that are there who really shouldn't be there auditioning to be on the show. You know what I mean? So yeah. So I agree with you. Now tell us a little bit more about this losing battle that traditionalists are fighting, or at least as you see it. I recently listened to a series of Sunday school lessons taught in a church at which one of my favorite theologians is an elder. And the teacher said that the popularity of this view, always held by a small minority of Christians to be sure, at least since perhaps the time of Augustine, has sort of been cyclical, always losing what small amount of ground that it might have gained. Do you think that whatever rising popularity our view has right now is something that's not likely to wane?
Well, I haven't polished the crystal ball lately, so it's hard to say. Now, of course, if annihilationism did wane, that wouldn't really mean anything. The evidence for it would be just as good as it is now. But I have to say I don't see it happening. And I think the way that communication of ideas happens now is not like it has ever been before. The proliferation of mass-produced books, our unprecedented access to the volumes of books from the past. We think, well, people knew a lot of stuff about ancient writings back then. No, they didn't. They didn't have access to them back then. We have access to writings from all over the world now that they simply didn't have. The phenomenon of the internet, my goodness, which is a real game changer, which means that any information on anything you want, you can have, means that it's impossible to suppress arguments and movements and ideas. People can access the best arguments for any point of view that exists in a way that they simply couldn't do before. A crackdown on the pulpits in a denomination, for example, not that I see it as very likely these days, isn't going to stop those people sitting in the pews from finding out that the case for annihilationism is really good, and it's not going to stop them from hearing and reading criticisms of what they're hearing on Sunday morning. So I'm personally inclined to doubt that there's going to be any significant slide back to the traditional view. I mean, it's been said the internet is a place where bad ideas go to die, which is good, which of course is traditionalism is still the majority view. And I can't see that changing anytime soon because it has such a stranglehold on things and institutions. But I think the undermining is only going to continue. Yeah. Well, at one point in the letter, you write, quote, "I do regard you, as all things being considered, being on the same team as me. We have a lot more in common than not as fellow believers in Christ," unquote. Indeed, the title of your letter calls traditionalists your friends, and you refer to them as your family. And yet, as you point out, and as you pointed out a couple of questions ago, many will likely take offense to your criticisms and have taken offense to your criticisms. What do you think that both sides of this debate can do to, on one hand, deliver challenging criticism lovingly but honestly, and yet on the other hand to receive criticism with maturity, recognizing the spirit in which it was intended? That's hard. It's harder than doing the theology. I can't really help that much with it either. I think it's a matter of, and this it's easy to say, it's a matter of wisdom and maturity, that we tell the truth about a really, really bad argument without trying to hide how bad it is. And I think it's equally a mark of wisdom and maturity that we understand, we can discern where the line is between doing that and simply being a jerk, being ungracious. And that's not easily taught. I don't even know that it can be taught. It has to be shown. It has to be something that you cultivate in your character over time. The same goes for taking criticism. I mean, we're sinners. We love ourselves. We love ideas because they are our ideas. And we take any criticism of our ideas personally for that very reason. And we're prepared to get into fights about it when we shouldn't. It's really that sinful tendency to treat our own status quo as the measuring stick of everything else. That's the hill on which we die. And that's the problem. Getting away from that, that isn't a skill to be learned in isolation. It's just part of a much wider picture of cultivating godly character. So it's a long process, and while it's very easy for me to identify where I'm pretty sure some traditionalists get some of this wrong, I mean, I'm the same. I treat my own current beliefs and actions as the norm, which means that I'm pretty certain I don't identify anywhere nearly often enough when I'm the one getting this stuff wrong and engaging in these tactics. So it's hard. It really is. It is, and it is a long process, but I would add that I think it's something that we have to be proactive and intentional about. And what I mean by that is many people who know me, I think, would say that I'm somebody who's very soft emotionally, in the sense that I wear my heart on my sleeve, and I
I do feel offended oftentimes when somebody challenges me, and I'll oftentimes read motives that weren't intended into the criticism. But what has helped me to mature at least a little bit is by forcing myself to be willing to respond to those challenges in an honest and mature way, and I think that kind of thing forces you to develop the kind of thick skin, a good thick skin that I think is necessary. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, you have to cultivate it. It's like a garden. You can let your garden go and it'll get big, or you can cultivate it and it'll get good.
Sure. Yeah. Well, now I've been saying for quite some time that one of the things that has convinced me most is what I've perceived to be the really bad arguments, is, to use a phrase you've said a few times, made by traditionalists. And that's really what you go on in your letter to lay out in detail, the ways in which traditional scholarship, as a result of bad scholarship, hastens the conversion of traditionalists to annihilationism. And you do this by identifying what you believe are four major ways in which critics of our view unintentionally sort of churn out converts to our view. And the first of them is, quote, "Your interpretation of the relevant biblical texts is really bad," unquote. Now we're going to look at some specifics in a moment, but just in that statement in general, summarize this problem and how the quality of their exegesis of the relevant text is something that, they wouldn't accept in any other context.
Okay, so what I did in that letter is I gave, as you said, 4 summary complaints, and then under each heading I went on to give examples of the kind of thing I was complaining about. Here my complaint was that the exegesis, that is, for those who don't know, exegesis is the analysis of the meaning of biblical texts. The exegesis that traditionalists use when making their arguments against annihilationism is just so poor that you really do get the impression. I mean, these are not dumb people. These are educated, really smart guys.
Yeah.
But their exegesis on this issue is so poor, you can see that something's going on. You get the impression that they're not just taking their ordinary skills, their ordinary exegetical practices that they use when it comes to any other interpretation of Scripture on any other issue, and just applying those normal rules to the special case of what the Bible says about final judgment. That's not what's happening. Instead, and this is what I'm complaining about, they approach these texts in a uniquely bizarre way, because they must, using methods of exegesis that just look like they were stitched together for this issue and no other. For example, I'll use just one example. Don Carson, who has, as evangelicals know, he has done some really good work, very scholarly work. He makes the argument, and a lot of others do it too. In that letter, I named Rob Bauman. There's another one. Christopher Morgan uses it too, and plenty of others. They make the argument that you shouldn't read the many biblical texts that refer to the destruction of the lost in the way that annihilationists do. After all, Carson says the apoleia word group, that's a Greek word, from whence we get words like apollume, or destroy, has a semantic range across a range of different contexts. So sometimes it refers to loss, for example, when the prodigal son is said to be lost. But when he's not talking about hell, Carson might might sort of tap us on the shoulder and refer us to his excellent book, Exegetical Fallacies, where he points out that when you encounter a word in the biblical text, you can't just assign to it a meaning that happens to exist within its semantic range. I mean, that's interesting, but it's not the be-all and end-all. Its actual meaning on any given instance will always be limited by the context in which it appears. So when Jesus contrasts the ability of humans to kill the body, and then immediately in that same context refers to God's ability to destroy body and soul, context says you can't use something like loss or some sort of non-fatal ruin there. Humans don't just lose the body, they kill it.
Yeah.
And similarly, in 2 Peter, the writer speaks about the divine judgment of the flood, where people perished. That's the word he uses, well, in English anyway. And in Greek, he goes on to use the same word group, the apoleia word group, to refer to future judgment and the destruction of the ungodly. Now, you can't just go reaching around for another possible meaning of the word, because the context has already told us what it's meant. People perished in the flood. They didn't just get lost. And yet this is what these teachers of exegesis would have us do, something that in any other context they would know is wrong. And that's an example of how I think principles of biblical interpretation just seem to go out the window when people think that they have to come up with a response, any old response to annihilationist arguments, because, it's their duty to oppose this point of view somehow.
Sure. Yeah, I agree, and let's talk about some of the other distinct ways and think about in which traditionalists do this kind of thing. I'm not going to go through all 7 of the ones that you list. I hope that the listeners will go and check it out, but I'd like to go through a few that particularly struck me when I began to question my view of hell. The first of these distinct ways in which traditionalist exegesis is really bad. You write, your exegesis is sometimes hasty and or careless. And you give as an example the way that 2 Thessalonians 1:9 has been treated by one of today's most noteworthy defenders of the traditional view, Robert Peterson. So tell us about that and about the broader point you're making about hasty and careless exegesis.
Okay. 2 Thessalonians 1:9 is a fairly well-known passage that speaks of a future time when Jesus will return in judgment. And it says that he will punish the lost with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord. That's the important part of the passage. The NIV actually muddles this somewhat, I'm sure they didn't intend to kind of mislead people about what the text was saying, but they tried to kind of smooth it over and make it make a bit more sense. So they have that he will punish the lost with everlasting destruction and shut them out. So it says they will be punished with everlasting destruction and shut out from the presence of the Lord. And Robert Peterson picked up on this. And he said that, Paul didn't only say that the lost would get everlasting destruction. He also said they would be shut out from the Lord's presence. And you can't be shut out from the Lord's presence unless you exist. Right. Otherwise, what's the point? Now, that's actually a little bit shallow. I mean, the NIV supports that, but nothing else does. And you'd like to think that, a scholar, a theologian whose profession is teaching people what the New Testament teaches would know that. But it appears that he didn't. And you go to all the other biblical versions. I don't have the ESV handy, but it says something like, they will be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord. So in other words, it's like they're blasted out of God's, not to trivialize it, but that's what it sounds like. It's like they're destroyed from God's presence. So they're not, and that's why they're not there anymore. It's because they've been destroyed. It's not because they've been destroyed, and then after they're sitting around having been destroyed, God shuts them out. It's not like, that's not how it's worded. I pointed this out in an article that I was fortunate enough to have published, and he still misunderstood. He came back and said, well, look at all these other biblical versions that say that they'll be outside of God's presence. all the versions that he quoted said exactly what I said, that they'll be destroyed from his presence. He didn't quite get the point. And the lesson here, the point is that this is an example of traditionalists who they're just not paying attention. They know what they need to get from these texts in the Bible, and they're comfortable racing over what look like mere technicalities of the text to get to that conclusion, and they don't even seem to stop and look when people identify problems with the way that they're getting there. Yeah. And that's the point that I'm making. You're just too hasty. You're not being careful.
Yeah. And let me piggyback on that to say that, to be fair, there are traditionalists who will try to make a case that in fact that's what the phrase in the Greek means, is that they're separated from the presence of God in some sense. But I think the broader point here is that it typically takes a while to get them to do that. They'll just brush over this in their presentations of it as if it's going to be accepted as being obviously in the text. Whereas if they were in any other context, if they were going to be trying to build a case for something, they would anticipate this being questioned, right?
Yeah, you could say, now, although it doesn't actually look this way, I'm going to make a case that actually this text also implies that they'll exist outside of God's presence. You can do that, and that's respectable. But to just suppose that this is obvious, no, that won't wash.
Yeah. Well, the fourth way that you identify the poor exegesis on the part of traditionalists is this. You write, your exegesis sometimes appears to intentionally exclude important evidence from the very texts it is meant to be explaining. And you give the example of Jesus' reference in Mark 9:48 to Isaiah 66:24's worm that won't die and fire that won't be quenched. This is, in fact, what I heard you point out in your podcast series that first got me wondering if perhaps I'd been wrong about hell. In fact, on Facebook, you saw this. I think I created a meme with this surprised looking koala bear on a tree, and I said Isaiah 66:24 describes corpses. So explain this example, and maybe you could give one or two other examples as well where important evidence is ignored.
Yeah. Okay. And the example of Mark 9 and Isaiah, as we say in this part of the world, 66 is a really important one. I can still recall when I was 20. As I said, I found out about the evidence, and a couple of years later, I decided to look at it seriously. Well, this is when I was starting to look at it seriously. And I was about to come out of the closet to some of my Christian friends and tell them what I thought about hell. And as soon as I told them that I was an annihilationist, the first reply I got back was, but Jesus said that hell is where the worm dieth not. Now, that saying in Mark 9 is influential because of the way that it appears in sermons and books as an example of Jesus alluding to the eternal torments of the damned. But most traditionalists, I mean nearly all of them, because you realize most traditionalists don't publish on this subject. Most traditionalists are standing behind pulpits and sitting in pews. Most traditionalists who present this verse as part of their case don't say much, sometimes nothing at all, about Isaiah 66, which is what Jesus is quoting. And when you look at Isaiah 66, you realize right away that the scene has nothing to do with eternal torment. You've got a vivid scene of divine judgment where God kind of swoops down in a flaming chariot with a sword and slays his enemies, and their bodies are lying around. And then at the end, you see the people of God looking on and seeing the remains, the dead bodies of the slain, and they're being consumed by fire and worms.
Yeah.
And you think, what's that got to do with hell? I mean, nothing. And so there's not even a hint of eternal torment. It is, if it is meant as a description of divine judgment, then it's annihilationism, because that's obviously what it is. I mean, it's the final death of the wicked. And if this was pointed out every time a preacher quoted from Mark 9, where Jesus spoke about the worm and fire, all the force of this quotation as evidence for the doctrine of eternal torment would be gone.
Yeah.
And there are other examples. I mean, one good one is the phrase eternal fire, which appears twice, well, on two prominent examples. One is where Jesus uses the phrase in that notorious comparison of divine judgment with a guy who has the sheep and the goats. And, you know, some will depart into eternal life, and others will depart into eternal fire, the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. And Robert Peterson, a guy that we've mentioned a couple of times already, says, you know, traditionalists ever since Augustine have gone to Revelation 20 to understand what the eternal fire means. Now, number one, why they would have done that is completely beyond me, as though that's a natural thing to do.
Sure.
But number two, why not instead go to the other New Testament passages that actually use the phrase eternal fire? I mean, you would think that's the most important evidence to look at. And so, for example, when Jesus talks about burning up the chaff with unquenchable fire, that's unquenchable fire. Eternal fire is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Jude talks about Sodom and Gomorrah as an example of eternal fire. Now, if you were to look at Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats, and say, okay, so there's this stuff called eternal fire. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to go and look at some other examples of how that phrase is used. And you went straight to Jude and saw that it was used to describe the annihilation of Sodom and Gomorrah. You'd think, wow, so that's what eternal fire does.
Yeah.
But instead, you've got people saying, no, don't look at the actual instances of where this phrase occurs. Just go to some passage that, trust me, describes hell. That's to exclude important evidence.
Sure. Well, and you know, you mentioned unquenchable fire, and I'll pick up on that a little bit because I think it's another example of what you're describing. There have been many times, in fact, I saw this happen as I prepared for my recent debate, where somebody will quote, burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. They'll even quote the NASB, which renders it burn up. And they'll ignore that part of it and totally, focus on the unquenchable fire, which of course doesn't mean never dies out anyway, and we can talk about that in some other episode, but they totally ignore the burn up there, the word meaning utterly burn down to ashes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a case of simply overlooking context. What happens when you throw chaff into fire, no matter what kind of fire it is?
It gets destroyed.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so the fifth point that you make under this heading is your exegesis sometimes makes unwarranted leaps in logic. And you point out some such unwarranted leaps of logic made by traditionalists when examining Matthew 25:46 and 2 Thessalonians 1:9. These unjustified leaps really struck me as well when I was rethinking hell. So what are these unjustified leaps that you're talking about?
Okay, the first one, Matthew 25, is the example of the sheep and the goats, which is a favorite one. We're at the conclusion of the story. Jesus said that the goats, the ones on the left, will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. And it's often assumed that the mere presence of the phrase eternal punishment clinches the case against annihilationism and for eternal torment. A well-known Christian apologist who doesn't generally write on the subject of hell, so I won't name him, but in a Facebook discussion, I saw somebody ask him, because people often go to such people for advice, what do you make of the idea of annihilationism? And he said, Matthew 25 rules that out. And that was the end. and it is, I mean, I understand that tormenting somebody forever would be eternal punishment. But it doesn't follow that eternal punishment is tormenting people forever.
Right.
That's one instance of what eternal punishment might consist of. But it's a leap in logic. It's a logical fallacy to assume that that's the only thing that eternal punishment... I mean, the discussion is about what the punishment consists of. Now, eternal punishment would amount to eternal torment if we had biblical evidence that the punishment for sin was torment. I don't think we do. If the punishment for sin is death, then eternal punishment is annihilation. It just depends on what you think the punishment consists of. But it's clearly a leap in logic and a completely unwarranted one that traditionalists are making there. Another one is, and this goes back to a passage that we were talking about a few minutes ago, and when Paul was writing to the Thessalonians and referred to the fact that God's going to punish people with everlasting destruction. And I recall reading Robert Peterson on this, and he said that he was talking about the way that annihilationists think that this refers to the final destruction of the lost, but he says, but Paul says it's everlasting destruction. It's difficult to reconcile that with annihilation. And I thought, what? I mean, there's clearly the cogs are turning. There's an argument going on in his mind, but he needs to lay it out and say, look, here is why everlasting destruction is inconsistent with annihilationism, because there's no clear reason why that must be the case.
Sure.
I mean, annihilation. I'm lost for words. Annihilationists read this to say that yes, they're going to be destroyed and there ain't never going to be any coming back. That's everlasting, and if there's a reason why we mustn't think that way, I'm sorry, it has to be explained to us. We're not going to do all the heavy lifting.
Yeah, and I think they've got to do something more than the response I sometimes hear about that phrase, which is, well, it would have been redundant for him to use everlasting because destruction would be everlasting. Completely ignoring the fact
that's not true.
That's right. All of mankind is going to rise from the dead, having been destroyed.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, the resurrection shows that death isn't eternal in its very nature. So, this is just a way of saying there isn't going to be any coming back this time.
Right. Well, let's look at one more of these 7 points. Your exegetical rebuttals are sometimes much too dismissive. Now, I've definitely found this to be the case time and time again, in fact. And as I was examining the case for conditionalism, when I would come across them, it really caused me to think something like, is this really the best rebuttal that they've got? I mean, they had quite the opposite effect intended. They drove me toward conditionalism. So maybe you could give us a couple of examples of these kinds of dismissive rebuttals.
You've just mentioned one of them, actually. The idea that, well, if punishment was annihilation, then eternal punishment would be redundant. I mean, you've got to think harder than that. I mean, you can't get away with it. Another one is when we come to passage, and this is not just true of the debate about final judgment. It's true about theology in general. Every point of view is going to have passages that make things difficult and are complex and are going to need some patient explanation. That's just... the Bible is complicated sometimes. I mean, I'm sorry, fundamentalists. That's the way it is. And for annihilationists, that is true of the book of Revelation more than any other part of the Bible. It's very graphic, very vivid, very symbolic, very full of imagery. And some of that imagery looks like eternal torment. And there isn't really any getting around that. Revelation 20, where it talks about the devil, the false prophet, and the beast being tormented in the lake of fire. I mean, that looks like the traditional doctrine of hell. And so we've got some work to do. And it's not that we haven't done it, but right. I'm just saying it's a difficult thing to grapple with. But it's at times like that when your opponents have work to do, and that's always going to be the case, where it's tempting just to be impatient and to be a bit naughty and to not acknowledge that fact for a moment and just pretend that, oh, no, if there's work to do, it just means that your case is implausible.
Right.
And so when we try to point out to traditionalists that there is difficulty in interpreting apocalyptic imagery and it shouldn't be taken at face value all the time, we get scoffed at, and people say, oh, you're not taking God's word seriously, as though we're just trying to get off the hook by saying it's all symbolic. And when we admit that these texts are complex, not just for us, but for anybody.
Yeah.
And it's not fair for people to simply dismiss this fact and write off what we say as mere rationalization. That's far too dismissive.
Yeah.
Far too dismissive.
Yeah, in fact, I'll be honest, I think that this position has possibly some of the smallest volume of this kind of recalcitrant evidence that you're talking about, the smallest volume of these texts that we have to do some really heavy lifting to reconcile with our view, than just about any other position out there, that evangelicals hold, and so I really suspect that the kinds of people who make these really dismissive waves of the hand and say, that, if it takes that much work to do, it obviously isn't right. Well, we could easily turn the table on them on numerous positions that they hold, and they're going to have to do the same kind of heavy lifting, but they wouldn't allow us to dismiss those rebuttals like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the language of destruction. The Bible always says that the lost are going to be destroyed and they're going to die. And when traditionalists like Don Carson come back and say it can mean other things, I take that seriously and respond to it, but I don't just say, don't be silly, you're not listening to the Word of God.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm going to encourage listeners to check out the other examples of this first problem, and we'll move on to the second one. And in this one you write, you are often unresponsive to the fact that the arguments you are now using, yet again, have already been addressed in the literature. When I have a casual conversation with a lay traditionalist in my church, I expect them to raise objections that have been answered by scholars from the past. But I don't expect this from the very kinds of traditionalist scholars that you talk about in your letter, those who know better, who've done the research. And yet I frequently see them doing just that. And apparently you do too. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, what do we do with that? I mean, it's a combination of a number of things. And I liken it to, and people might disagree with me about the philosophical issue that I'm about to raise. That's fine. It's just an example. I am passionate about a number of things besides the doctrine of hell, thank goodness. I mean, I write about the relationship between God and morality quite a lot. That's one of my favorite subjects. And I am a proponent of what's called divine command ethics. And I'm constantly complaining that usually atheists, people who don't believe in God and who don't believe there's any relationship between God and morality, are always raising the same objections to divine command ethics that have been dealt with, 50, 60, 100 years ago. But I guess I say that to point out that it's not just this issue. It's like that in general when it comes to partisanship, unfortunately. But another issue is that Christian scholars, Christian evangelical scholars, are expected to be warriors on behalf of the point of view that their churches want them to be warriors on behalf of, regardless of their knowledge and their familiarity with the field sometimes. It's like skeptical objections to the resurrection that have been answered by people who wrote 400 years ago, but who's going to go back and read 400-year-old conservative Christian writing? It's like this. I doubt that most traditionalist scholars have ever read Henry Constable's book, which is over 100 years old, on the nature and duration of future punishment. But it's a really important scholarly book on final punishment. So I think, unfortunately, there is a lot of unfamiliarity with the literature, and people charging in and assuming it must be because you aren't familiar with this argument.
Sure.
Or sometimes it's the assumption that their readership is going to consist of people who already agree with them anyway. And so all they need to do is give them the feeling of assurance that their position is well defended.
Sure. Yeah. Well, one of the things that can be most frustrating is when one's position is misrepresented, which leads us to the third way that you think traditionalists are making converts to annihilationism. You write, some of you visibly mischaracterize the case against your position. Tell us about some of the ways in which they do that.
Yeah, and that is frustrating. And I mean, some stuff's frustrating, but this is kind of disappointing. I mean, you shouldn't be seeing this kind of thing. But Chris Morgan, who is one of the louder evangelical voices on the subject in recent years, says that the annihilationists' misunderstanding of certain aspects of their doctrines of God and sin have shaped most of their arguments. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, but what he's doing is he's saying to his readers, this is the misunderstanding that lies at the heart of their arguments. This is the way you can dismiss their arguments because they involve this guy. Look, I'm sorry. Pointing out the way that the Greek word apollumi is used in the Synoptic Gospels has nothing to do with my understanding of the doctrine of sin.
Yeah.
That you can't mischaracterize me as simply misunderstanding God that way. It's a way of saying, look, don't look at their exegesis. They're fundamentally off track.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. You don't get to do that. one that comes to mind is in the book Two Views on Hell, which is a really good book, actually, for seeing the two views and their relative strengths presented, Edward Fudge and Robert Peterson, when Edward Fudge makes the observation, a clearly correct observation, that the phrase eternal punishment doesn't have to mean eternal torment. And he did this by saying, look, even someone that you guys listen to, Jonathan Edwards, acknowledged this point. Now, of course, he knows that Jonathan Edwards is not an annihilationist, anything but. Sin is in the hands of an angry God. But Jonathan Edwards basically pointed out that eternal punishment just means that whatever it is, it's forever. He said, so if your objection is simply to the punishment being eternal, then you don't get any relief by running to annihilationism, because I'm afraid that lasts forever as well. That's basically what Edwards said, and he's right. And Peterson comes back, quotes a whole bunch of statements from Jonathan Edwards that prove that he was not an annihilationist, and says, Fudge errs, therefore, when he claims that Edwards was an annihilationist. So you get to portray people as making fundamentally stupid claims.
Right.
And I don't know the effect of that. I don't know how many people read that and thought, wait a minute, he's got the wrong end of the stick. But when stuff like that happens, it's just really bad for the discussion. It means the wheels get bogged down. We don't get to progress things. We have to go back and go, no, you've got this wrong. Let's correct this, and then we can continue the discussion.
Yeah. Just to follow up on the first example you gave of, we're characterized as people who, we've got these preconceptions about justice and about what it would be right and merciful and loving of God to do, and so we have to twist the scripture to fit those preconceptions. I think there's a real danger in misrepresenting it. Not only is it immoral, in my opinion, to misrepresent people that way, because for many of us, including myself, that's never entered into the equation at all. But I actually think it's really dangerous for their own position. I remember one of my listeners, I'm not going to name him, he was impressed by the case that I had made in my first debate on this topic, and he was sitting in class, he told me, and a professor began making some really silly mischaracterizations of annihilationism, one of which is this very issue that we just twist the scripture to fit our preconceptions about justice and morality and stuff. And so he decided if I remember correctly, he pulled up my opening argument that I had sent him in text on his phone and played the role of devil's advocate against his professor. And now I this person I'm talking about isn't a traditionalist yet, but he told me that he realizes now that our view is not based on those kinds of things. It's based on a powerful, compelling exegesis of the text. Now, I can only imagine that somebody who's been told for years that annihilationists are mamby-pamby people who can't handle the idea of hell, when they see that, oh, whoa, there's a biblical case to be made here, that can't help the traditionalist case. Do you know what I mean?
No, it's like being found out.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway. So there's one more of these problems that you list, the fourth one, and you write, you have very badly underestimated the strength of the biblical case against your position, and are rather obviously relying on the belief that your position is the established and popular one. So explain that for us.
Yeah. Traditionalists have invested a lot of time in colleges that have got statements of faith, including the doctrine of eternal torment, teaching students who are there partly because they already believe those statements that annihilationism is false. Now, that's not the way to advance their cause, because you wouldn't go to those colleges if you were an out-and-out annihilationist. You'd think, wow, either I wouldn't be allowed there, or I'm certainly not going to be happy with the climate there. You're always going to have people in that context who are sheltered, because they're never, ever going to be exposed to an argument against their point of view. And from behind, I guess you could call from behind the barricades, they've become convinced that their view is the only sensible one for Christians to take, and that opposing views can just be flicked away with a flick of the wrist, or as Martin Luther said about the devil, he blows them away with a fart. But seriously, I've met people who have told me, yes, I'm familiar with the annihilationist view and I know that it's weak. And when they say that they're familiar with it, they mean that they've been taught that it's not true.
Yeah.
But they've seriously underestimated things, because with those very same people, when they encounter even the slightest whiff of the case for annihilationism, they don't know what to do. I mean, they either freak out and get aggressive, or they are simply unprepared. They didn't know what was coming.
Yeah.
And tradition. I guess I shouldn't be saying to traditionalists, look, improve your tactics, defend your troops better. But they really don't understand how effective a cogent biblical case against their position is going to come across to one of their students or to someone who has been treated the way that they treat the recipients of their preaching. They've simply misunderestimated. They've simply misunderstood the way things really are. That they're relying on the fact that their belief is established, that it's popular, and that people aren't ever going to have to worry about what they will do when they come across the alternative.
Yeah. That really describes me to a T. This is exactly what happened to me. I thought that I had looked at both sides of this case, and when I was presented with just a few of the rebuttals, like you say, it turned my world upside down. But this leads me then to my next question for you, because we've discussed some of these various ways in which bad traditionalist scholarship is turning out converts to conditionalism like me. And, our hope is that traditionalists listening to this and who will read your letter will take it to heart and take this debate more seriously and carefully. But here's the thing. What if they do? What do you think a case for traditionalism might look like? How compelling could it be if it doesn't suffer from the kinds of problems that we've been talking about?
Yeah. That's a really good question, because it's like, how should your opponent in this fight, how can he improve his game? But I have no problem doing that, because I think that we have the winning horse. I happen to think, I came to this position because I think the Bible clearly teaches it. Here's what we have now. What we have now is traditionalists making ridiculously strong claims based on really, really bad arguments. There is a way to improve that, and that is they have to make much, much weaker claims based on more modest and careful arguments. I suppose it was reasonably recent, less than a year ago, I read the book by Francis Chan,
Erasing Hell,
and Sprinkle, and Erasing Hell. I didn't know what to expect. I mean, I was taken aback by how gracious the approach was. They were very kind and nice, and that kind of actually got irritating after a while. I thought, come on, just make your case. But what dawned on me is I thought it was a weak book. It didn't make it made the claim that annihilationism was false, and it made the claim that the doctrine of eternal torment is true. I came away thinking that was really weak, but the reason that it was really weak is because it was not as stupidly ambitious as a lot of traditionalist books. It didn't try to make the very strong and untenable arguments that others tried to make. So I guess that's kind of what a better case looks like. It just means that they end up not really making a very good case for the traditional view, because you can't reach to all this evidence that isn't there. Right. You have to make a very, very modest claim. And as it is, I think if they took more of the evidence into account and took it more seriously, it would have been better, but then it would have been a case for annihilationism.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think there's a cogent case to make for traditionalism. So I think the more cogent a case becomes, the less of a case for traditionalism it is.
Before we wrap up, I do have one more question for you about your letter. Has there been any sort of response from traditionalist scholarship to this open letter that you've written to traditionalist scholarship? Have you heard from some of the people that you've mentioned in the letter, like Morgan or Peterson or anybody else?
No, not even a whisper. I mean, I've heard from a lot of people who read these guys, who just quietly have been taught by these guys, who have had their world shaken up, but not even a peep out of the the actual scholars, the professional theologians and writers who I'm talking about. I mean, I don't take anything from that fact. I mean, I'm just a random blogger. Maybe they don't even know the letter exists. Fair enough.
What about just lay people then? I mean, people that aren't traditionalist scholars but who are traditionalists who read that letter. What kinds of responses have you heard from them?
Well, I mean, I have yet to hear from anyone who thinks that, or who has moved towards traditionalism along the spectrum as a result of seeing what I've had to say there. No one, as far as I can tell, has been hardened in their resolve by reading what I had to say, which is good, and it reassures me that I'm not being too rude. But clearly, I mean, you can go and look at the comments on that blog thread, or of course, there's the private correspondence that I've received, which of course you can't see. But if it's had any effect at all, it's had precisely the effect that I wanted it to. It's caused a lot of people to say, wait a minute. And that's all I was trying to do.
Right. Well, that's great. Okay, well, then let's begin to wrap up. In light of everything that we've talked about, recognizing that we could, of course, be wrong about the persuasiveness of a case for traditionalism that doesn't suffer from the problems we've been talking about, and hopefully we're open to the possibility that it is, in fact, we who are wrong when it comes to hell, even if our case is the one that seems to be more persuasive at this point. What sort of parting message would you leave to any traditionalists that are listening right now, particularly scholars and apologists, for their view of hell? What most do you hope that they take away from your letter and from our discussion today?
From this discussion and from the letter and from the positive case, which people may have heard by now, and from just about anything else that I say about this, I don't mind if you're not convinced. That's not the be-all and end-all. I don't have to win you over to my side. But I do want you to change the way that you think about evangelicals, your family, your brothers and sisters who are annihilationists, because I all too often get the impression that people believe we're infiltrators. And that is a disastrous mistake. You should absolutely welcome arguments for annihilationism in your classes, among your students. It should be like a science lab where if you're trying to get to the bottom of what is causing this chemical reaction, and you find that evidence shows that it is this, you should be, I'm pleased to have discovered this evidence. Now I'm closer to the truth. It shouldn't be, and I know this is true for me, I know it's true for annihilationists as well. It shouldn't be this partisan game of guarding our position. It really shouldn't. And I know the risks that are involved in saying that, because people will say, what about doctrines where it really, really matters what you believe? And I have to say, I think the same thing about those as well. Yeah. You have to go with what seems to be true. You have to go with the evidence that exists. That's the thing for me. I really despise the partisanship that infects these discussions. And I want people to share that.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. In fact, when I was on Unbelievable with Justin Brierley talking about this, I made the point that while the idea of hell, whether it be the traditional view or ours, is something that really terrifies me, at the same time, it really terrifies me to see the way that this kind of partisanship divides people that are members of the body of Christ. I think it's a real hindrance to unity. Okay, well, I really appreciate your time today. Where can listeners go if they want to say hello to my little friend, and how can they get in touch with you?
Right, for the podcast, probably the easiest thing to do is to go to the iTunes store and search for Glenn Peoples as the author of the podcast, or say hello to my little friend as the title of the podcast. My own blog and also the podcast is www.beretta-online.com, and there you'll be able to contact me through the web contact form. You can also have a look at anything else I've said there that may be of interest on this subject or others. Yeah, so that's how you can find out more about me and what I have to say.
Great, and I'm sure that listeners will be looking forward to the next time you host a show, as you did a few episodes ago, and just thank you so much for your time today.
You are more than welcome. Thank you.
Well, there you have it. Hope you enjoyed the interview. Do read Glenn's open letter in its entirety. You can find a link in the post for this episode at rethinkinghell.com, or you can just go to www.beretta-online.com and search for an open letter to my traditionalist friends. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes of the Rethinking Hell podcast, for interviews with Jeff Cook, Douglas Wilson, Justin Brierley, and much more to come. Remember that the podcast is available in iTunes by simply searching for Rethinking Hell, and we always welcome your reviews there, which we'll read out on the air whenever possible, as we've done in episodes past. Remember, too, that you can follow us on Twitter at Rethinking Hell. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us for the next episode of the Rethinking Hell podcast. Until then...